with me, we'll have a silent prayer to begin. Amen. I've had quite a few people come forward through the week with questions, ones that could be answered in class, ones that really need to be done at a board but didn't relate to class. So I would like to encourage everyone, as our organisers asked, to write down your questions and hand them in prior to the question and answer session this afternoon. We'll be working off questions that have been written, not ones that come in from the audience, in case you're not familiar with that mode of operation. I know that we have quite a few new faces here today, being Sabbath, that haven't necessarily been here through the presentations previously. So I want to give a brief update, but even for our students, those who have been stepping through these studies with me, it's easy to become tangled in the different concepts that I really want us to have in our minds. So I just want to go back. This is why I erased the board and start again, because I want us to detangle those concepts, try to separate them. You may have observed the board work before. All it was our reform line, end of modern Israel in the black. Then in the blue we had the end of ancient Israel, the history of Christ. And in the red we had the history of the Millerites, beginning of modern Israel. So we just started to overlay those three histories. Going back, a brief review, just the dot points of what we've studied this week. We went back to our reform lines and we looked at the repeating pattern. We have 4 dispensations: ploughing, early rain, latter rain, harvest, if we want to use the model of agriculture. Within each of these dispensations, there must be a message that does the work of that particular agricultural process. So there must be a message that does a work of ploughing people, a message that does a work of watering them, a message that does a work of harvest. And this message comes, first of all, quietly, and then it's going to swell. And we looked at 2 witnesses in our reform line to demonstrate that. We have the very beginning, increase of knowledge, formalization, and then in the history just prior to the close of probation, we have the also increase of knowledge, and then the midnight cry or the loud cry. Symbolized, if we were going to use the history of the Millerites, the 3 camp meetings: Boston, messaged unsealed; Concord, swelling, increase of knowledge; Exeter, midnight cry, formalized. So we reviewed that increase of knowledge in each step. We looked at the symbology of, if I was to plug it in here, of those camp meetings in Millerite history. Do we have any more black pens for anyone that, if we do? Otherwise I'll just work off blue. I think this one's dying. But in our history, in the history of our latter rain, we also have Boston, Concord, and Exeter. And those camp meetings come as with particular symbology. So we looked at Concord, the meaning of the word concord. If that one will, oh, thank you. Thank you. Concord, coming into an agreement or union. Exeter, always having some relation to time. So we looked at those camp meetings of Boston, Concord, Exeter. Once we'd done that, we looked back yesterday, just in one class briefly, how we can demonstrate these reform lines from the history of Christ. We identified that while we go to the world, to the Nethinims at the Sunday law, we also see in the history of Christ, 34 AD, they go to the Gentiles or the world. So the Sunday law waymark, where God's people, faithful people, go to the world, is the same as in the history of Christ, paralleling end of ancient Israel, end of modern Israel, when they go to the Gentiles in 34 AD. It's the end of the 490-year time prophecy, and prior to the end of that 490 years, the gospel was restricted to the Jewish people. They were not permitted to go to the Gentiles. So we lined 34 AD up here, and the concept that gives us is that when we look at the New Testament, all the history, the knowledge given to in those writings from Matthew, Mark, Luke, John into Acts, that history of John the Baptist, the work of Christ, the crucifixion, the resurrection, all of that history is telling us of how God prepares his church in readiness to go to the world. So all of those gospel messages are about telling us the history of how God prepares his church for the Sunday law, to do a work at the Sunday law. So a nominal Adventist who doesn't understand that history, reform lines, they're looking for the Sunday law. It's like a Jew looking forward to 34 AD and bypassing the ministry of John and Christ. And we know if they did that, they would come to 34 AD, and by that stage, what happens to the institutions? Passed by, shut down. Acts 27, shipwreck. So that was the review, how we reviewed the history of Christ. 34 AD, they go to the world, but we observed they went to the church in 2 steps. First of all, John the Baptist, and then Christ. They did a work within the Jewish nation. They pulled out disciples under the ministry of John. We have the baptism of Christ. After Christ's baptism, does he begin his work? No. Then we have the imprisonment and death of John. The same point in time that Jesus is formally beginning his ministry. We can see a transition in leaders there. Then we have the cross, the test of the first group called. At the cross, we have the disciples tested. They go through this period that becomes relevant for us, from the cross to Pentecost. Further instruction, training that they require becomes extremely relevant for us now, this history of the cross to Pentecost. And then at Pentecost they go back to the Jewish people, back to the nation of Israel. So twice for the church, first in the history of the disciples, and then at Pentecost, it spread much more widely because of the feast. The Jews have come from all different countries where they were exiled to, and the gospel is again presented to the church. Then in 34 AD, that work is completed. They close their probation as a nation, and it goes to the Gentiles. So in brief, that was our understanding of the history of the end of ancient Israel, and we observed how they had these misconceptions about the nature of Christ's kingdom. Ellen White tells us this was John the Baptist's greatest struggle. He misunderstood the nature of Christ's kingdom. And why did he do that? 2 reasons. You can raise your hands. The 2 reasons for John the Baptist. Brother Willie. Why did John the Baptist misunderstand the nature of Christ's kingdom?
It's because he has the same mindset with the Pharisees.
1, he has the same mindset as the Pharisees.
And 2, he did not know how to move from literal to spiritual.
I'm going to put them together. That's a good reminder. I wasn't going to remind us of that, but that's a good reminder. He didn't know how to move from literal to spiritual. They looked back, like the Pharisees, they looked back at the deliverance from Egypt, and they thought the deliverance from Egypt would be repeated in their days, the deliverance from Rome. So they've taken the literal deliverance from Egypt and applied a literal deliverance from Rome. It's a misunderstanding of parables. I saw a hand, my brother. Same thing? What instruction was he given specifically where he would have expected a deliverance from Rome? Does anyone remember what we touched on? Brother Rogers? The prophecy of Zechariah in Luke chapter 1. There's a prophecy given to his father Zechariah. And what did that prophecy say? That we would be delivered from our enemies. It says, "Blessed be the Lord God of Israel, for he has visited and redeemed his people, and has raised up an horn of salvation for us in the house of his servant David, as he spake by the mouth of his holy prophets, that we should be saved from our enemies." Who are their enemies? The Romans. "And from the hand of all that hate us. That he would grant unto us that we, being delivered out of the hand of our enemies, might serve him without fear, in holiness and righteousness before him all the days of our life." So there's this prophecy given that they're misunderstanding, that somehow this deliverance out of the hand of our enemies, that we might serve him without fear. They're going to take the history of Moses, and this is their expectations of what that would look like. Delivered from Pharaoh, that they can keep the Sabbath without fear. It's an application, but they are not using the rules of parable teaching. It's the problem of the Pharisees, and it's the problem of John the Baptist. It's described by Ellen White as a misunderstanding of the nature of Christ's kingdom. So that's the work under the first angel. Then comes the work of the second angel, Christ. And he takes those same disciples who are holding on to those misconceptions, and he starts saying to them, the kingdom of heaven is like, parable after parable story, trying to explain to them what the nature of the kingdom of heaven is like. So that's also what we touched on, the work of the first angel, how there are still these misconceptions about the nature of the kingdom of heaven, taken from the Pharisees, who are just in a Laodicean condition. So that's all I want to repeat about the history of Christ. The history of the Millerites. All that we touched on was that they knew they were repeating the parable of the 10 virgins. So from 1798 to 1844, there's a first group called and trained, yes? And then when is the shut door in the parable of the 10 virgins? October 22, the shut door for the first group. That lines up with 2019, the shut door for the first group. And prior to the shut door, you have April 19, a tarrying time, and then you have Boston camp meeting. What happens at Boston? Message opened up begins quietly in a transition in leadership. Here we mark 2014, transition between Miller and Snow. Same way, the beginning of the ministry of Jesus and his first temple cleansing. The change of leadership from John the Baptist to Christ. It's a visible change in the leadership of the movement. And we mark Boston, Concord, Exeter being the midnight cry. Shut door experience. So that's all that I wanted to touch on as a revision of yesterday and our last few days. How we've constructed these reform lines. We also touched on the history of 9/11 to Sunday law. In the line of the 144,000, this is one dispensation. 9/11 to the Sunday law. So in this history, we must have an increase of knowledge, formalization, this is a Boston, this is Concord, Exeter. So we had a little bit of a discussion on 2019, how that has been an increase of knowledge. And those who have left this movement, what did they reject? Two messages. One, message of the Sunday law and equality. So they've rejected the message of the Sunday law and equality. And how many reform lines are we on? Two. Line of the priests, increase of knowledge, formalization, and what does it have to do with? Equality. 2019, increase of knowledge for the 144,000. Increase of knowledge on what? Sunday law, because is the focus of the message backwards or forwards? It's not an increase of knowledge on 9/11 exactly. I want us to note the increase of knowledge in Islam on 2019. Did we have an increase of knowledge on the subject of Islam in 2019? Yes. But even with that study, is it focused forwards or backwards? Forwards. So I want us to remember that it isn't just Sunday law that we have an increase of knowledge on. It's an increase of knowledge on the Sunday law and on Islam. And what did we start to study in Islam? What was presented about Islam in 2019? My brother.
What was presented is the line of Canada war, and also the restriction of Islam.
Sorry, the second part you said?
Restraint of Islam.
Restraint of Islam?
I think it was going back to Daniel 11 verse 40 as understood by the Millerites, and the backdrop of their message was Islam, and trying to apply that to our history, where we showed that the primary application of 1840 is not 9/11, but are we marking between Rafia, so 2019 and 2021.
So what we understood, going back to understand the Millerite understanding of Daniel 11 verse 40. We all remember that now that we're reminded. Is anyone not familiar? I won't do it now, I just point you to presentations. But we had an increase of knowledge on the Sunday law and on Islam, and how we interpret Daniel 11, how the Millerites interpreted Daniel 11. So we have subjects here. So people have rejected more than one subject because we're on more than one reform line. So when they reject the message of equality, they're also forced to reject the increase of knowledge also given on the line of the 144,000, because they've fallen off the path to the wicked world below. And if you fall off the path, you can't receive the message on either line. we're going to come back to 2019. What I wanted us to consider, specifically review and consider in this class, is how all of this relates to the Nethinims, particularly in the history of 2014 to 2019. So there's one element on our line that's missing, and what is that? What's an element that we added last? 2004? Where do you want me to place that? On what line? Nethinims? So my sister said that we have 2004 on the line of the Nethinims. Why would we place 2004 on their line, my brother?
Okay, the element that we miss is the 10 years period that helps us to go back to 2004 in all the lines.
So you're talking about the 10 years prior to 1989. We have a 10-year history. And what was the opportunity given to Adventism? Sorry?
To see and recognize the external event.
To see and recognize the external events. My sister in the back in the pink. There's two of you in the pink. The one behind first. What are the external events here? Give me one. 79 to 89. This is a 10-year history. A 10-year history where Adventism had the opportunity to wake up and see the signs. Were there signs given before 1798? There were signs given, yes? Sun, moon and stars. Some of them occurring after, but beforehand. There were signs that led up to 1798. There's signs that lead up to 1989. And we mark a 10-year history where Adventism could have seen those signs and been prepared in anticipation of the time of the end. 79 and 89. What occurred in this 10 years? There's a war. We know that in 1798 there's been a war between France and the papacy. And in 1798 the papacy loses, yes? So there's been a war between the Soviet Union and the United States, and in 1989 the Soviet Union loses. Do you know what this war is called? My sister in front, if you want to help. There's the Cold War, but then there's specifically a 10-year war that drains the Soviet Union, and one of the main causes of it is its collapse. Sorry? Afghan War. Does that bring back the memory? The Afghanistan War begins in 1979. The Soviet Union goes in and they decide to establish their own proxy government and prop it up, and they end up in a proxy war that drains their resources to such an extent. It's a main cause of their collapse. So this is the 10 years of the Afghanistan proxy war. Another one. Sister Joy? Moral majority? Can you give us a little history of that? What is the moral majority? So I'm going to repeat you for the camera, and then you can tell me if you want to add anything. It's an attempt to enforce morality through the government, and it's a counterattack against the civil rights movement. Do you want to add anything else? Who headed the moral majority? Jerry Falwell. So it's Jerry Falwell and Liberty University. Liberty University is his Christian college. They opposed desegregation and the civil rights movement. Jerry Falwell leads the evangelical leaders to find their political voice. They form the moral majority. It's a religious organisation of the evangelical leaders, but they are working through politics, and they work on the election, their first real victory, the election of Ronald Reagan. And then, after Ronald Reagan, endorsing George Bush Sr. So it's a successful movement. They're able to place Reagan and Bush, and we know they are the two presidents that we place at the time of the end. And Jerry Falwell says now everything is in place. We've succeeded in our mission. We've got evangelicals speaking politically, and now a conservative government or politicians in place who can enforce our morality. That is church and state already coming together at the beginning of our reform line. We know they start to have a war on their hands once we start getting into the years of Bill Clinton and particularly, especially Barack Obama. So we have this 10-year history where the priests are given an opportunity to wake up. This being, right in red, the priests. So when we come to the Levites, what must they also have? 10 years. We just compare and contrast. We know the 144,000 do, the priests do. So we come down to the history of the Levites, and 10 years takes us from 1991 to 9/11. And 1991, is that a significant year in history? You have the fall of the Soviet Union, the release of the World Wide Web. It's a great deal we can place in 1991 that gives the church an opportunity to wake up a second time for that second group. But our focus is on the Nethinims. How were they supposed to be waking up from 2004 to 2014? So from 2004 to 2014, they're meant to be stirring or waking. 14 to 19, they have an increase of knowledge, and it's formalized, and this is the history of their ploughing. Increase of knowledge in 2016, and it's formalized in 2018. Do we have a message formalized in 2018? My brother. I think there's relevancy to that, the introduction of YouTube in 2004. And we can place, it's a separate thought, would take us down a different direction if we started tracing these technological advancements and how they connect to reform lines. We know if we go back to the Protestant Reformation, we have the introduction of the printing press, right on time just as they need it. And as our brother said in 2004, YouTube. These things become significant. When was Wikipedia released? 15th of January 2001. So we have, at every waymark, we have these, we can connect this also technological increase of knowledge. I won't do that now. So that's a good point. When did Trump join Twitter? 2009. Is that not an increase of knowledge? Is that not him finding his voice? So, coming back to this dispensation, 2014 to 2019, it's the ploughing of the Nethinims. And I want us to focus for a moment on what this looked like. Because we know that this ploughing history, it's in the same history as our latter rain. So I want to make sure that we're connecting these. We have a message that comes in 2018. And what is that message? I'm going to take that history, the priests and the Nethinims, and draw it here. Because I want us to focus on what we're doing here. 1989, we have had 10 years. This is the history of our latter rain. And when we bring this first group, the priests, and we bring it down to the third, the world. They begin in 2014 to 2019, but they also must have a 10-year history from 2004. So we're connecting our dispensation with their dispensation. So this is all really still a review from yesterday, because we looked at our dispensation and we identified a message released, increase of knowledge 16, formalized in the message of 2018. We reviewed in this history the two streams of information. We've had two streams in every one of our dispensation. Every message released comes with its own test. We see that in the ploughing, in the early rain, and in the latter rain. And if there's a test, you have more than one choice. You can't be tested if you have only one choice. So there must be a correct answer to a test and an incorrect answer to a test. That is how simple two streams of information becomes. So we know that when we come to 2018 in our history, there are two streams of information. One is false and one is true. When we talk about this message, what date in 2018 in the United States? October 3. We then came down to the history of the history of the world. We identified that they have also been in an increase of knowledge from 2014 to 2016 with Trump's election, taking them to 2018. There's a shut door for us. It's the close of probation for the priests, and it's also a test for the Nethinims, a shut door. If you can't be benefited by the first angel, can you be benefited by the second? So has the first angel tested you? Has the first angel tested you? Yes. Because if you fail the test of the first angel, you don't receive the second. So it's a test for us and it's a test for them. Therefore, they must also have two streams of information. They must be able to either fail this test or pass this test. This is when we went back and looked at the information that they received. October 3 is our Midnight Cry message. In US cinemas in late September and October of 2018, there's two different documentaries shared. One of them is the Trump prophecy. And what does the Trump prophecy say about Donald Trump? Do we all know the name Kellyanne Conway? Do we all know she has a husband, George Conway? He posted something on Twitter last night, this morning, that's worth looking at. It's an interesting person to follow. If you don't mind the language, because there's some swearing in it, I think, which almost entirely comes from Trump himself, he's just collated all of the, not all of them, but many of the times you have the evangelicals saying this man is ordained of God. To speak against Donald Trump is to speak against Jesus. All of these quotes he's collated, or someone has collated and he has shared into this one about 30-second clip, and it's really interesting. But some of those concepts are shared in the Trump prophecy. This is October 2018. October 3, 2018, the message is given to the movement. October 2 and 4, the Trump prophecy airs in US cinemas, and it says, no, Donald Trump, he's King Cyrus, he's prophesied as the president God has chosen for this people to bring us back to morality and our Protestant roots. The same time period, there is another documentary, I think around September 27 into October, and that is Michael Moore, Fahrenheit 11/9. So whether or not everyone saw Michael Moore's documentary, these are as polarized and as opposed to each other as you can get. The two different versions of what is happening inside America. You have America polarized between these two different viewpoints. And I wanted to highlight that this is Michael Moore. And in Fahrenheit 9/11, what is Michael Moore saying? I'll put it up here. You have our Midnight Cry message, and what did we say in 2018? We said Trump equals a dictator. We said Trump equals the last president of the United States. We already knew that, but we know more what it looks like. What else do we say? We we said Trump equals Hitler. We became more specific. My brother?
If you liken Trump to Hitler, specifically look at the concentration camp in Uganda.
I couldn't quite hear you, sorry.
Concentration camp, Hitler, which equals the issue of immigration.
Yes. Yes, he's connecting it back to immigration. Can you raise your hand so I can... Sometimes I find it hard to find your voice in the audience. That's the...
Okay, you address about Trump and the press. And you brought many lines.
Trump and the press? What date are we looking for? And finally, where do we say this all began? Cause? It's going to lead to the effect. The cause that led to the election of Donald Trump in the first place and his subsequent behaviour. So this is the midnight cry message. It's much of what we're covering. What does Michael Moore teach in Fahrenheit 9/11? Does he say Trump is a dictator? Does he say Trump is Hitler? Does he say Trump is the last president of the United States? He can't look forward. The Nethinims don't have prophecy, but is he highlighting November the 9th? And when does he say this all began? 2014, when he discusses Flint, Michigan. Does he speak about Trump's behaviour to the press? I'm not sure about that one, but our brother put it there, so I'm going to go off those who've seen it more recently. So we see that what Michael Moore is saying in Fahrenheit 9/11, he's pointing the Nethinims back to November 9th. He's focusing on November 9th, 2016. We are focusing on November 9th, 2016, but we have the ability of prophecy. So we can project that forward to 2019, which we did. But we see that this message that Michael Moore has, the formalization of the message to the Nethinims, it's giving the same message to them as we receive, essentially. So what tested us in 2014 to 2019 is the same test, essentially, as tested Levites and Nethinims. It's the same test for all three groups. We were tested on equality. How do we respond to the issues of racism and sexism? How do we respond to nationalism and immigration? The same way that the Nethinims were tested. How do they respond to sexism, racism, nationalism, immigration, all of those issues? Our prophetic subjects were also their subjects that they were forced to confront purely through external events. Can we see that? Do we have any thoughts or questions in relation to that? My brother.
It's an interesting observation that I have made. On October 2, 2018, a journalist from Saudi Arabia was killed. His name is Jamal Khashoggi. And Trump, instead of condemning the murder, decided with the crown prince of Saudi Arabia. So I think that is connected to October 2nd.
So our brother is speaking about the assassination, killing of the journalist Khashoggi, journalist who worked within Saudi Arabia, and how Trump responded to the killing of a journalist. 2014 is the Sunday Law. What do we see happen? Country after country after country falls to the Sunday Law. They essentially elect their own Donald Trumps. So their own countries are going to be emboldened to attack journalists, to become nationalistic and work within their own version of church and state. If we want to see an interesting view of that, just look to India. It's not Christianity and the government that's come together. It's my brother.
I have a question on nationalism. What's wrong with nationalism? Because I believe that what we see in society, right, is its basis in the family setup. Like for me, I'm a father, right? What comes first for me is my immediate family. Everything else comes second. Those are my duties. And the idea that as a country, we should work towards rebuilding our country. I don't see anything wrong with that in some because if anything actually mirrors the ideas of the home unit that actually Illinois talks about. So I don't understand why we bash nationalism so much.
I think what we need to do is separate patriotism and nationalism. When we come to the subject of nationalism, what nationalists do, I'll give you one good nationalist, Adolf Hitler. The people in France in that history, they loved their country. They took care of their country and they took care of their people. But when Hitler comes up, that's a populist nationalist movement. And the concept behind him is that he's going to advance the cause of his country at the suffering and expense of every other country. And that is what you see Donald Trump doing. He's going to make America great again by enforcing through tariffs, through any means necessary, through closing borders, whatever is necessary, dissolving NATO, dissolving the European Union, doesn't care, as long as it benefits his own country. When we work as a family, we focus on our family, but a community doesn't actually function well unless we take care of each other as a community, as a society. That's why we have government in place. Not just to take care of one family, but make sure that there is care as a community. And the European Union, the United Nations, NATO, their idea is, yes, we take care of our country, but no country actually becomes great unless they take care of the other countries and around them in some type of society. They came out of Adolf Hitler as a mechanism to ensure that that type of nationalism, the benefit of our country at the expense of others, does not arise again, which is why we see those nationalists having to do a work to destroy them.
But you see what you did there? You chose an example, you used Hitler as an example of a nationalist. But the people like Ben Franklin was a nationalist. Why can't we use him as an example? Because
Who was a nationalist?
Benjamin Franklin, one of the founding fathers.
You think they were good?
Okay, I mean, everyone has his own quirks, right? Everyone.
You think the United States was right to go and annex Hawaii and Canada and Texas and California?
I didn't say any of that. You are saying that. I didn't say any of that. I'm just saying, you just use one example of a person who was a nationalist, but he was a nationalist in the wrong sense. But I'm saying, you can still be a nationalist in a good sense, but you're not talking about annexing. You're not talking about annexing. I'm just saying, you can be a nationalist, a patriot, who is not like Hitler. It's possible, because there are examples like that in modern history.
There's a reason that Obama would never use the word nationalism. There's a reason you don't hear Obama say he's a nationalist. Because that word, what you did is you said nationalism and then tied it to patriotism, and they're not the same thing. Obama would say, I'm a patriot, I am not a nationalist. Because nationalism is a term that speaks about the concept of benefiting one country at the expense of others. The founding fathers of the United States didn't originally do that. They believed that America should not interfere in foreign affairs. They wouldn't have gone to war with Iraq. They wouldn't have become colonialist. That didn't last long. By the time you get to 1840, 1844, late 1800s, they want Texas, they want Canada, they want Hawaii, they want the Philippines. They were becoming nationalist already in that history. I'm not going to debate the term with you because you're taking us off track. But do a study on nationalism. The reason that the European Union and the UN rose up is to protect the world against nationalists like Hitler that had decided they were going to benefit their own country, forget Hitler, go back to Kaiser Wilhelm, colonialism, going to have a place in the sun. at the expense of other countries. And what has happened is it's not just Donald Trump. What does Bolsonaro now do? I'm going to make my country great again at the expense of who? What happens if the Amazon burns? And he says, I don't care. Helps my economy. I don't care about your climate change. I don't care what happens to you. What does Britain doing? I don't care about the European Union. I don't care about working together. If we get it out of the European Union, then we can establish ourselves. It's the same thing we see in, Modi in India. Don't care about the other religions, don't care about the other countries. This is the specific brand of nationalism that we see rising up from 2014. Trump is the very first, and you would never hear Obama and others refer to themselves as nationalists because they know the implications of saying that, of saying those words. And when Trump stood up and he said, I am a nationalist and I'm going to wear that with pride, he said that so strongly because he knew the message he was sending to the people. He knew that he was transmitting a message. And when he said that, the kickback from Obama and those who knew what he was saying to say, how dare Trump call himself a nationalist? That is not who we are as Americans. It's a term that has divided. Everyone knows that is not a kosher term to use. Back to our subject. 2014, we see this beginning swells of what is going to lead to the election of Donald Trump. From 2015, his campaign, 16, his election, we can trace him 17, 18, Battle of Heraclea, starting to overthrow the other branches of the US government, and then we come to 2019. And what I want us to see is that what tested the priests in the first history is the exact same thing in our latter rain message that tested the world in the history of their ploughing. Can we see that? We can see that. We lined up our Midnight Cry message, our view of who Trump is and what he's doing, of the issues over equality and nationalism, that is the same issues that have divided, polarized America into two separate camps. So just as we're tested on these issues through purely external events, they are also divided and tested. Can we see that? When we come to the ploughing of the Nethinims, what we are essentially doing is comparing and contrasting the Nethinims with two of our histories. Because it's their ploughing, what do we compare and contrast it to? Our ploughing, yes? So this is the point I want us to have in our minds and hold on to and think about it and settle into it. The ploughing of the Nethinims, we can understand it through comparing and contrasting it to two of our histories. First of all, our own ploughing, 1989 to 2001, and second, to our own latter rain dispensation of 14 to 19. Does that make sense to everyone? Does that not make sense to anyone? Comparing and contrasting the ploughing of the Nethinims, if we want to understand the beginning of their reform line, we must compare and contrast it to the beginning of our reform line, but also understand it as comparing and contrasting to our own latter rain history. Makes sense? So in the history of September and October, there's a school in Arkansas, and we see demonstrated two streams of information. September and October for the Nethinims, compare and contrast. Two streams of information, yes? The true stream is giving the same message as us, yes? But we're not just doing this, we need to go back and compare and contrast it with our ploughing. And prior to our ploughing, there's a 10-year history, and then the raising up of a messenger, yes? 1979 to 1989. 10-year history where the church has an opportunity to see the external events and wake up. Therefore, that the world, the Nethinims, they must have a 10-year history from 2004 to 2014. I want to remind us of one point. When we talk about the external two streams of information, Fox News, CNN, who is that for? Who is that information to benefit? Someone raise your hand. My brother?
I think it's both of them. Benefits both of them. The priest and the Nethinims.
Why would it benefit the priests?
Because it
What's
is,
your evidence?
it is in their dispensation of flower, where you see a true and a false thing.
So where do you see the two streams? 1996. We see CNN and Fox. CNN isn't, it's just a title. If we hadn't kind of already placed these titles, I'd prefer to go to Yahoo, Washington Post, Google, New York Times. Google not being a stream of information, but like YouTube becomes significant. But Yahoo, Washington Post, New York Times, those articles going online, we place in 1996. We also see Fox News begins in 1996. So we see that those two external streams, whether they're for Trump, polarized for Trump or against Trump, they're also there to give the priests an understanding of what's happening, an understanding of these external two streams. Does that make sense? So when we come to Michael Moore, I would suggest it's the same thing. He's there to benefit both. The priests need to see him and understand who he is. We need to have that clarity. So do the Nethinims. So when is Michael Moore's first documentary? 1989. Michael Moore makes his directorial debut in 1989, and what was that documentary called? Roger and Me, and it was all about a crisis in what town? It was all about a crisis in Flint, Michigan. Flint, Michigan is his hometown. It was where he was born and raised. So in 1989, he releases his first documentary on Flint, Michigan. First documentary in Flint, Michigan, 1989. I know that we have a sister here that's going to do a worship one night and give us more information on Michael Moore and what he's done through these years. I just want us to identify him in 1989. He does another significant documentary. This is Fahrenheit 11/9. When is Fahrenheit 9/11 released? 2004. So what is meant to wake up the Nethinims? What does he cover in Fahrenheit 9/11? Reason for the Iraq War, corruption of George Bush. He should not have been president. He won that election illegally. All of that he covers in Fahrenheit 9/11. Can we prove that through our prophetic message? The nature of the Iraq War, that it was purely an excuse. Where can we prove that in the prophetic message? Third Diadochi War. If we were to go back to the wars that we've been studying over the last year and a half, we can demonstrate the correctness of Fahrenheit 9/11. We can demonstrate that George Bush was an illegitimate president. In Daniel 11, who do we line up with George Bush? False murders, an imposter, yes? So prophetically, can we justify his message? Yes, it's prophetically justifiable here, and it also is in 2018. Fahrenheit 9/11, Fahrenheit 11/9. So they have a 10-year history to wake up. They're seeing the Iraq War, the corruption within the Republican Party, this... I'll leave it with that and we'll move on. But they have this 10-year history, and then when it comes to the formalisation of their message in the history of their ploughing, in 1996 we have the Time of the End magazine, and what do they have? Fahrenheit 11/9. Do we have any questions or thoughts on that? So there is a movement that's beginning here, yes? A movement of priests. It's not just one man, it's not just Elder Jeff, it's a movement that's rising. So when we come to the world, what's beginning here? I know there's only one movement when we talk about a reform line, but I want us to separate that in our minds. There is a movement of priests and a swelling movement here of Nethinims, that they will come in and join us in their harvest, yes? So there's a movement of priests, there's a movement of Nethinims arising here. It's not just Michael Moore. And the other one that we spoke of was Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. When is she born? October 13, 1989. AOC. If I was to write, someone asked to write her name? I'll write it in black. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She's born October 13, 1989. October 13 becomes a significant date. We line it up with the midnight cry as it enters Europe. And we connect her back to 2018. In June 26 of 2018, she defeats Joe Crowley. It's her first election. She draws international recognition when she wins the Democratic Party's primary election in New York, June 26, 2018. And then in the biggest upset of the 2018 midterm election primaries, she defeats her Republican opponent, November 6, 2018. This created a storm within the United States, and she has become a symbol of everything that Donald Trump and the Republican Party hates. She is Michael Moore-style leftist. And where does she come from? Does anyone know her background, her parents? Immigrants from Puerto Rico. So for Donald Trump and his supporters, she represents everything that they're opposed to, everything that they hate. First of all, she comes from immigrant parents. Second, she's not really white. Third, she's a woman. So she becomes the focus point of all of their hatred. And then we talk about those that allied with her, known as the Squad. Other immigrants, two of them Muslim. They've become the focus of far-right hatred. And we also place her rise in 2018, connected with Michael Moore and the rising up of this movement that is diametrically opposed and in opposition to Donald Trump. Do we have any questions or thoughts there? I know many people were not familiar with her. Yes, my brother. Sorry? October 13, 1989. Yes, my brother.
I have a question of the family, yeah? So they have a movement there. The movement has already started, but when you can even see the family is. Are you getting me?
No.
If you can go louder, sorry.
Okay, I was saying, you see from 2014 or 18, you can trace it backward, the movement has already begun from the Nephilim. And there is someone there who is giving them the right message of which you can call a reformer. Then we are talking that at the end, at the time of a harvest, we are going to harvest them. So it was like, what is the use, or what are we going to tell them which they have not? Because I'm seeing them there, they have the right message, and God is working with them there. What is the need of us calling them, and what are we going to tell them?
So they're already on a right track, yes? They're seeing the issues with equality when it comes to race, immigration, gender. And your question is, what then do we have to give them? What then does their harvest look like? Is everyone okay with this covering of Michael Moore, AOC, how this movement has risen in direct opposition to Donald Trump? We're okay to see how that's a movement leading to the Nethinims. They're opposing the president who's going to introduce the Sunday law. They're opposing the coming together of church and state. Yes, my brother.
So you talk of 2014 that there's a crisis of Flint, Michigan.
Yes. So in 1989, it's a crisis in Flint, Michigan, the basis of that documentary. When Michael Moore releases Fahrenheit 11/9, this is why I said that he has a similar connection, that he's seeing 2014 as the cause and Trump as the effect. We say 2014 cause in that respect, and 2019 as the effect. He does the same thing because in 2014 there's a crisis in Flint, Michigan, where their water source is changed and their water, the water of the town becomes contaminated with toxic amounts of lead. And this creates a lot of anger, and he highlights in this history Obama does not handle this well. And he sees this as being part of the popular uprising that leads to Donald Trump. So we also see a crisis here in Flint, as our brother reminded us of. And he ties that to the rise of Donald Trump. So we only have a few minutes left. Do we have any questions on what's been done so far? This makes sense. We're comparing and contrasting their history, their ploughing with our own ploughing. We see that we had someone rise up to give a message, they have someone rise up to give a message. 10 years, 10 years. This is all focusing on external events, that's the difference. They don't receive a prophetic gospel message. But we're also comparing and contrasting our latter rain with their ploughing. We have these two streams, September, October, they have those same two streams and we're being divided over the same issues.
I just had another line of thought that when you speak about the Nethinims and the 10-year preparation, you can also tie it with the story of the king of the south. You can see Putin rise as a dictator in 2004, and you can still mark Putin at 2014 when he annexes Crimea against the will of the G8 and he is removed from the G8. So
Yes.
around the thread of the king of the south.
Yes, that's a good point that we will close on, is to see that this isn't just one subject of Michael Moore. There's, like we look back at this 10-year history, we can tie Iran and Iraq and the moral majority and the Afghanistan war. There's multiple threads depending on our story. We come to 2004 and 2014, and there's this other thread. 2004 is when most secular sources would mark Vladimir Putin as really becoming a dictator, taking a dictatorial control over his countries and their local elections. 2014, he annexes Crimea. So that's a neat other thread that we can remember to tie into these waymarks. A good Nethinim is also seeing Russia in this history. They're seeing other threads. Donald Trump, the evangelicals, also connecting with the King of the South, the rise of Vladimir Putin, which we know then connects into the 2016 election. It all becomes relevant. Yes, my brother.
Okay, we have compared, we have brought in this history Michael Moore and Alexander Cortez. Now, in the line of priests also, can we compare with introduction of two messengers, a lady and a gent? That will become a noise for us to compare.
She's working closely with another man. They worked like that. He was black. So you have in the rise here, you do have a woman and a black man. So I would suggest yes. You can see it with AOC in her own team. I think a spokesperson that they worked extremely closely, and Obama and Clinton. So we see them all in this history, external and internal.
If I'm getting the same, that you can mark Michael Moore as a man, and you can mark AOC as a woman, you have two reformers or two people who are trying to plow the nations. Just like in 2014, you have the second lady and the third lady, a man and a woman.
Yes. We might touch on that point once we've added some more logic. So we know that their reform line extends. This is their ploughing, then their early rain, then their latter rain, and then their harvest. The question I want everyone to think about, and we'll come back to, is the question our brother raised before. What does this look like? What do we bring to them? And I know that swirling through the movement right now is many different concepts and ideas about what happens here and the role we play in this. So I won't ask the question now because we are out of time, but I want us to think about that. And when we come back, share our thoughts. Look at some further thoughts regarding their harvest. If you kneel with me, we'll close in prayer. Dear Father in heaven, thank you for our blessings. Lord, we know that you have raised up this movement to do a work in unity and give a specific message. Lord, there are many concepts that we are struggling with. I pray, Lord, you'll give us clarity and understanding, that we can know what we are meant to be doing right now and have a clarity of what you expect of us now and in the coming years. Lord, I pray that you bring your movement into unity on these subjects. May we be willing to look at the evidences with all humility and come onto the right side of these issues. I pray, Lord, that you'll bless the remainder of the Sabbath day. We know that we have more sessions, time to spend together and discuss privately and in meetings. I pray, Lord, that you might be in the midst of us and guide our minds as we look at these things. I pray you'll be with our brethren also all over the world as they wrestle with similar concepts. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.